So what I do now is very different from what I studied in UA&P, which is, by the way, like a good lesson in people, on kids obsessing over their majors. Like, this is not destiny. You can definitely shift. And I've done a couple of shifts in my career. There were maybe two tracks that were going on in my life at that point. So I went to UA&P specifically to do the IMC Pro. It was back then called IMC. I fought my parents to go to UA&P. I was really clear. I want to go to IMC. I wanted to be a brand manager. I was pretty convinced that I had the skill set, and it seemed like just a really fun thing to do, to kind of build brands and communicate and all that. And there was another track that was going on at this time where I was like a student leader. I was really interested in why certain orgs and certain teams were better than others. And then somehow over time, that second track, which is really mostly a hobby and just for fun and mostly like a way to meet people, kind of became my core job. So then I had a chance to then marry both tech and kind of this obsession over organizations and teams. And then that brought me to Google to do work for these engineering teams within Google, but it also gave me a chance to spend time with startup founders. That's where I then get engaged with them. Like, it's from this marriage of two things. So let me tell you the quick arc of AI, right? So kind of throughout that 70-year history of AI, really a lot of AI lived in these computer labs. Only in the last few years is it now in the world, and people are starting to ask really big questions and grappling with really big problems around this technology. You know, you could approach it the way an entrepreneur would approach it. Look, let's just kind of build products and design our way into deploying this technology. And then you get things like social media, which like early on, no one thought it would create any harm on the world. So we want to do it differently this time. And so as this technology is coming into the world, and specifically in my role, I'm looking at how it's coming into the workplace. We want to make sure that we are closely studying its impact on organizations, on work, on early career folks. Like, imagine you are currently probably really worried about whether you will find a job when you graduate. And that's a real fear. And the numbers actually show that that's actually the situation right now. And it's a confluence, obviously, of the technology and, you know, the macroeconomics and all that. But like, we should be asking really tough questions, such as if organizations continue to skip out on hiring young entry-level talent, like what does that look like 5 or 10 years from now when they're trying to promote people who will become really effective managers in this organization? We should ask the question around, well, what skills matter in the future? And are the skills that kids are studying these days in college, do any of that actually matter? How do we even get students to learn these skills? Because we know that when you are over-reliant, there's a really interesting study. And when they took away the use of the AI chatbot, their skills declined even worse than if they never had the AI to begin with. That's a problematic question, but that's also a good empirical question to study and to figure out, well, what are ways in which we can build this technology that actually not erodes human skills, but actually augments humans. You know, it's funny, I speak on panels quite often, and when people ask me what my background is, they're often expecting me to say something like, oh, I studied engineering. I very sheepishly tell myself like, oh gosh, like, do I tell them that I have a liberal arts degree? But I tell you, like, in the past few years, it's been very popular to be able to say, like, I actually studied the humanities in college. And I now clearly see the value of that, because the engineering training is it's a bit mechanistic. It's very much like, okay, here's the use case. How do you build an elegant piece of code that gets you there? Whereas the humanities asks these broad, big questions of like, well, should we build it? And if we build it, do we need to think about the value systems that gets baked into this thing? There are people who are playing important roles that have this humanities precisely because of this line of questioning. Like, how do we ask the bigger questions, the bigger, harder questions that are very scary to grapple with by anyone, but also by someone who maybe thinks of the world as one big problem space that we can break down into component parts and attack the problem one at a time. Well, unfortunately, the real world doesn't work that way. The real world is this complex amalgamation of all these societal problems. And I do think that the future needs to get crafted by both the engineers of this world, but also people who've learned the humanities, who learned philosophy, who learned economics and psychology. And that's kind of my orientation to the world, is very much more from an organizational behavior, organizational psychology lens. So I had this one professor in UA&P who taught us marketing research. Basically, he presented market research as not how do you get consumers to do what you want them to do, but he presented it as how do we know what is true about consumers, about brands, but really how do we know what is true, and what are the methods that we can employ that approach this big capital T truth, right? And he talked about, random sampling and the value of qualitative versus quantitative, like all the basics of market research. But it really impressed on me this idea that actually there are ways in which we can overcome one person's view of the world with data and strong logic and argumentation to see which of these competing opinions actually holds true. I thought it was really fun. And that was the one thing that I took from my time in marketing that I could easily take on to today. Well, one, it was managing my team back in the day, and then it was market research. It was the research work. And so I tend to come to any problem space, whether it's orgs being effective, teams being effective, or AI getting deployed into organizations effectively. Like I approach it very much with that research orientation.